So in leading up to 1 Samuel 24, David has been in a couple caves already hiding out. And he starts his cave life pretty lonely. And he writes some psalms about that. He talks about a time when darkness is his dearest friend. That's how David spent many of his years in the wilderness fleeing from murderous King Saul. But he gathers as many as 400 men, and it gets harder and harder to hide. If you've ever played sardines, the more people that gather around. So he almost gets caught a couple times, but God always seems to intervene, whether it's the Philistines counterattacking and Saul has to leave following David to go fight the Philistines off, or some other group or whatever. But this time at chapter 24, the local people have said they see David, they're keeping tabs on him, and Saul believes that this time he's going to get him. 1 Samuel 24. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the camp, near the crags of the wild goats. All right, so they had a very specific place where they knew he was in this area. So he came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands, for you to deal with as you wish." Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." With these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. Before I forget, that's really strong language there. David rebuked his men. How often have you rebuked somebody lately? We know that all Scripture is for correction, rebuke, and correction in righteousness. All right? Train it so that every man may be thoroughly trained. Rebuke in the Hebrew, even stronger than in the Greek, is this idea of he literally tore into them. He gave them a talking to. Like, how could you guys have said, go ahead, this is the day the Lord has made for you to kill Saul. This is the Lord's anointed. He rebuked his men, did not allow them to attack Saul, and Saul left the cave and went his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed." Keep noticing the hand, how often the hand gets mentioned. "See, my father," verse 11, "look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. This message in itself was originally titled "Soul Survivor: The Basics of Wilderness Training." Some of you may have remembered the Survivor series that I think is still going. We're by Witt and, there's 3 W words there, where, people's will and lasting out, they try to be the last survivor on the island. The soul survivor, S-O-L-E. But this is about our souls, S-O-U-L, surviving. What does it take for a soul to thrive, to grow, not just survive, but to grow? What would it take for a shepherd boy to become a king? It would take many years of training in the desert. Many of God's leaders endured wilderness training. A little quote here from an author, Nancy Newhall. She writes, "The wilderness holds answers to questions that man has not yet even learned to ask." The wilderness strips us down to the basics. Even Jesus, right after his baptism, right after the voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." I like the way that Mark's gospel, the Go gospel, at once the Spirit sent Jesus into the desert, and he was in the desert 40 days being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. There's something about the contrast of the wildness of the wilderness and yet the beauty and holiness of God. There's something that all of God's people need to experience in order to come to the end of themselves, to see the holy God for all that he is, to see their own sin, their humanness, their vulnerability, their dependentness on God alone. Something about wildness that is actually beautiful. It's interesting. We often, being in a big city is not always my favorite thing, having grown up on the farm. Fortunately, we're on 25th Avenue. It's only 25 blocks down to the lakefront from our house in Kenosha. And there's a little stretch of beach there that's never been developed, the Kenosha Dunes. In fact, it's been ravaged by the high water. Lately, we've lost a couple hundred feet of the coastline in that little section of Kenosha Dunes. So it looks different every time we go for our quick little hike there at the end of the day, as often as we can, at least probably 3 times a week. Winter, spring, summer, fall, we do it. Because there's something about being outdoors. There's something about being by a big body of water. There's something about sand and wildness. Something that gets our attention, that quiets our soul. And there's also these great big rocks they're trying to put up now to hold the shoreline. And of course, that gets all the graffiti of all the kids. And most of it we wouldn't want to talk about, or you really don't want your grandkids to see. But most recently, I noticed during COVID that someone most beautifully painted there is beauty in the struggle. There is beauty in the struggle on this jagged piece of coastline rock. Indeed, we all have to face wilderness experiences in our lives to come back to the basic reality that God is our rock, that God is the first thing we need to remember, the place we need to go. David in the Psalms, so often, the Lord is my rock, the Lord is my refuge, the Lord is my fortress, so much so that at the end of the story, when Saul returns home, which sounds like a good place to go, but David and his men went up to the stronghold, to the refuge, back into the desert, back amongst the rocky crags, back to the caves, back to wilderness living, to continue to experience growth in God. So God is the basic. And we are in the desert because we do need to be tested, even as Jesus was tested. And to see that it's only by God's word. Man does not live by bread alone. You know, another show my wife has really caught on to now is the show Alone, where they get these survivalists, you know, they tell you at the beginning of the show, don't try to do this unless you are a trained survivalist. But they literally get 10 people to go out in regions of British Columbia, sometimes even the Arctic, sometimes out in China, Mongolia, and live on the land for as long as they can, finding their own food. But the interesting thing is that in so many of those cases, those people who have to build a fortress, some kind of fort, some kind of tent, some kind of dwelling, because they start usually in September and they go 30, 60, they get into fall and winter, and they better have a good, secure place where they can burn a fire and stay warm when winter comes. But not most often, but very often, what sends people home is just the desire to be home, just to be with their loved ones. They realize that being alone is not easy, and that man does not live by bread alone. Though they sometimes, some of them get lucky and get a great big elk, some of them have to live off of trapping squirrels or rabbits. Some of them literally eat bark to get by. But all of them need what all humans need: fellowship, encouragement, hope, a reason to go on. David knew that he was to be king. Before he goes into this other cave again in chapter 24, while he was at a different cave in chapter 23, we see this. While David was at Horesh, this is chapter 23, verse 15, in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Now that's a good friend, someone who helps you find strength in your God, who renews your faith. Don't be afraid, said Jonathan. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father knows this. Then the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. Jonathan, David's sworn partner of friendship, comes to him, probably the last time they saw each other alive, to strengthen him in the Lord, to strengthen his hand. So at the beginning of this passage, and then again at the end, from Saul himself, David hears God's will for his life. You know, the thing that really tipped the balance for me tonight and said, I'm just going to focus on this chapter, is to realize that it's out of the wilderness experience, and it's in particular out of this cave experience that David writes Psalm 57. I would encourage you to turn to that if you can a minute. Psalm 57. We have a beautiful contemporary praise song. Well, not so contemporary anymore, but remember the song, be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. That comes out of Psalm 57, that beautiful praise song. But if you look at the subtitle, the descriptive title of Psalm 57, it says, this is for the director of music to the tune of Do Not Destroy. It's not a very pretty title. Of David, a Milcam, when he had fled from Saul into the cave. Into this cave, David goes, gets into this uncomfortable situation of seeing the king do his business, but out of that experience comes this beautiful praise song. This is a pretty interesting phenomena. Let's take a deeper look at how this happens. How being in, let's just say it, crappy situations in life can be the times when God will create the most beauty if we are willing to look for where God is in this ugly situation. Another quote, and I believe this came out of the book that I was using and I've loaned to Drew too, from Peterson's book. The way we see the world is the way we will be in the world. The way we see the world is the way we will be in the world. So now we're going to talk about the main point of this passage, having anointed eyes. All right, so let's take a good look at this. For all the reality, but also for all the hidden beauty. Here's Saul pursuing David, and they come to the crags of the wild goats. And then verse 3, they come to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there. Because of my experience down under in Australia, I finally got what's really going on here. If there's sheep pens, that means this is a gathering place for shepherds. If there's lots of sheep, there's lots of shepherds. If there's lots of shepherds, there needs to be a dunny, an outhouse. Guess what? This cave is the primary place for people who want to have a little privacy to go to the bathroom. David and his men think, Saul would never come in this cave, not the king of Israel. This is the crappiest cave there is. So they are hiding. They are desperate. They go into this dark, dank cave. Lo and behold, just so happens, nature calls, and this is the very cave where Saul himself chooses to go to the bathroom. All right. There he was. There's light at the end of the tunnel. David and his men are far back in the cave, but when they see someone coming in, and he's tall, and maybe even a glint of light is coming off his war crown, they're like, you got to be kidding me. It's King Saul himself. He's not coming in here looking for us. He's coming in here to go to the bathroom. David's men, man, their wheels are spinning. They're like, this is too good to be true. He's going to be a sitting duck. You know, I can't really hardly preach this without saying puns, without intending it. But, you know, there it is. This is the reality. But this is how they're seeing this situation. This is how they're choosing to see this situation. So let's go to this little quote. The men said, verse 4, this is the day. This is the day the Lord has made. Well, they don't quite say that. They're not singing a song, but this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Sounds like they're quoting some verse from the Bible, right? This is the day the Lord spoke. And you're like, when did the Lord speak that? What book of the Bible is that in? Hezekiah? Yeah, that's exactly what's going on here. How often haven't we heard someone say, God told me, or God showed me this, so this must be God's will, right? We see what we want to see. We hear what we want to hear. We already have decided what we think is the right thing to do, and then we try to justify it with God language. This is David's men. This is a very big temptation. Jesus faced 3 big temptations in the wilderness. Turning stones into bread. You're hungry. Eat. Just why go to the cross? Why not just fall down and worship me here? And I'll make you Lord over this earth. You and I will rule this together. Forget God in heaven. Or hey, didn't God say that, this is where the devil gets tricky. He quotes the Bible too. Didn't God say that, that you will not dash your feet on the stone? He will put his angels in charge of you, lest you dash your feet upon the stone. So throw yourself off the temple. Those angels will catch you. And this is what David is encountering from his own men, his own loyal men, saying, isn't this exactly what God is speaking about? This must be the time. God has given Saul into your hand. So David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. But immediately, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner. Why? This is how Peterson phrases it. This is what the men saw. They saw the king on his throne, viewed from the backside, taking a dump. But David saw the anointed of Israel upheld by God until God chose to dispose of him. There was something about that light at the end of the tunnel. There was something about the daylight and the reality of what David would face when he would come out of that cave. Something about God's light in all situations that even as a king presented himself in such a base way, David did not see that. He saw God's anointed. God's anointed. It keeps coming back. The anointed of the Lord. And with these words, David rebuked his men. He went out afterwards and said, my Lord, the king. He showed respect for the office, for the anointing of God, of the Spirit, even for a king who was not a very good king. Even for a king who had come to take his life, David says, I will not lift my hand against my master because he is the Lord's anointed. Yes, I have this piece of robe. But David was seeing, how could David do that? Let's go back to Psalm 57. Listen to Psalm 57. Listen to the agony of David all these years. Have mercy on me, O God. Have mercy on me, for in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. How many times had he hidden behind rocks and in slot canyons and in dank caves? I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. And that was the text that my father-in-law had asked me to preach on for his funeral. These first 2 verses, God have mercy on me. It was a time in my father-in-law's life where some really hard things happened in the family. And in a sense, they lost their land, they lost their home. They lived out of a mobile home for a couple years, and in the meantime, they started traveling and working for CRWRC, for Wycliffe translators. And when they weren't doing that, they were just living in the fairgrounds in Hudsonville, Michigan, until they could find a place to finally settle in again. And during those years, my father-in-law chose this verse. God was his refuge. I cry out to God, to the God who fulfills his purpose for me. And it's hard to go through midlife. It's hard to go through old life. It's hard to go through any part of life where it seems we're being treated unfairly, when we wonder what God's purpose is. But David never lost sight that God would fulfill his purpose. And he had been reassured by Jonathan, his bosom buddy, that he would be king. And at the end of this episode, even King Saul reaffirms again, David, I know that you will be king. He sends from heaven and saves me, rebuking those who hotly pursue me. God sends his love and faithfulness. I am in the midst of lions. I lie amongst ravenous beasts, men whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are like sharp swords. But God let David see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that same light shone on King Saul, even as he did his dirty business. Even though he was there to kill David, David would not lift a hand against him. He would respect the Lord's timing and the Lord's way. He would not take matters into his own hands. But he would speak with Saul. Look how wise, look how humble and wise David is in these following verses. Verse 12, back to chapter 24, 1 Samuel, verse 12. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. This is so interesting because in the next passage, of course, David wants revenge right now against Nabal the fool. But here he's willing to, at his best, say, the Lord will avenge the wrongs you have done to me. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. And this, as I find, this next little speech of David, as a very humble but wise trash talking of himself. David's sort of trash talking himself in front of the king. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? David, who am I that you bring out 3,000 men? Come on, Saul, really? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. And may he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. Saul's cut to the heart. Even Saul, in hearing David's humble, wise words, finally sees the light. And he weeps. He calls out to David as a son. And he says, you have just told me now of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered you into my hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Man does not live by bread alone, and man certainly does not live by revenge. We learn that God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. And then we hear, even from our enemies, even from the most unlikely places, that God has a purpose for our lives. David will be established. And Saul begs him to have mercy someday on his descendants. David. Anointed eyes. How we see in this world will determine how we will be in this world. Let's pray.